Welcome to Fort Worth 148's podcast, where we meet to discuss Masonic topics and strive to build value in the brotherhood. The opinions and statements of the participants do not represent any positions or stance of any Grand Lodge or Lodge and are solely the viewpoints of the participants.
Welcome to the Roadcast, Part 2.
Right, the hotel cast.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Billy, why don't you introduce us into podcast Part 2?
Absolutely. This is Billy Hamilton. I'm a past master of Fort Worth 148 and past master of Texas Law Research, since that is what we're here for this weekend.
Hell yeah.
And we have with us
Chris Ruli, member of Federal Lodge number 1 in Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Washington Lodge number 22 in Alexandria, Virginia. And this year's, thanks to a committee of nice men like you, Anson Jones Lecture, was this 2024?
2024, that.
Am I pronouncing Anson Jones right?
Yes, Anson Jones.
Anson Jones.
Yeah.
There it is. So I've accomplished the bare minimum.
Right. And now you've seen his statue. It's actually one of the two that's in that foyer.
That's right.
Grand
Is it the
Lodge.
one on the left side when you walk in?
It is. The other one is San Houston. Yeah, and they have the apron that you can now see at TLR.
That's very cool.
Unless we're wearing our super red new past master regalia.
It's very red.
It's very red. It's
with the gauntlets.
I'm interested though. It may look really good with the tuxedo.
You know, the thing about a tuxedo is less is more with a tuxedo.
Okay, that is true.
I know. You didn't expect me to say that.
No, but it's true, right? That simple elegance. You don't want to go too flashy
elegance
with it. You don't want huge lapels. That's why I always feel the
Masons have huge lapels. Is this new?
Well, because
Fuddrucker. No, what is it? Was it Fuddrucker?
Pieces of flair?
Yes. How many pieces of flair do you have?
Right.
I have 3, 5, and 7 pieces of flair.
I have 33 pieces of flair.
Oh, look at you. Well, excuse me. Yeah.
It's not a Masonic event unless you receive a lapel pin.
I think they were giving out lapel pins, by the way. So what was going on today? Today there was a...
Today was the statewide York Rite Festival. I think this is the second official statewide York Rite.
Really?
Festival.
Oh, I thought that's something that happens all the time.
No, it happened...
Or annually, at least.
Last year. And so now that it's happened for the second time, it is the official second annual statewide York Rite Conference.
That's so funny. I've had the same issue where I had a high school English teacher that said there's no such thing as first inaugural or like first annual.
Yeah. That
term first annual does not exist. It's not a thing. So when you do it second time, then you can say it's the annual.
Right. But inaugural is appropriate, right?
Yes, inaugural absolutely. Event. But when someone says first inaugural, that's just like saying, like, I don't know, hot air balloon.
Our chai tea, right?
Yes, chai tea. That's right. That's very good.
I want some TT.
Yeah, some TT. Well, speaking of, I don't know. Actually, this is a family podcast. So that's fine.
At least a proper Masonic podcast.
That's right.
All things that are proper to be written or listened to.
Sounds like ritual to me, man. No, I'm just joking.
Proof it.
Yeah. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. You know, especially because we can't publish our minutes.
That is really interesting. That's a Grand Lodge?
That's a Grand
Texas
Lodge law.
Thing.
Yes, you cannot publish the minutes of a Masonic lodge.
Now, minutes of a Masonic lodge, what? You bought and sold. You paid $25 to the guy who paid rent or whatever. It's not like it's Masonic ritual. It's who showed up that night.
Right. Yeah.
How did they vote?
The worshipful master opened the lodge into an ancient form at this time.
That's right. Minutes were read.
Yeah.
Green beans were eaten.
That's right.
Or maybe not eaten because it's a meeting.
Yeah.
A presentation was made by, Joe Schmo. We all left at 9:30. The lodge closed in harmony at 9:45.
Right. Yeah.
You're not allowed to print that.
Yeah. And ritual never goes in the minutes. So it's not anything against publishing ritual, which we can't do that either. And we just recently got our cipher books. They came legal. They've been around forever, like since the 20s, 30s. You had King Solomon and his followers. But it's been within the last, I would say, I think Jerry Kirby was the Grandmaster And you know what? I have to give him kudos because when he went up there and made the announcement during his Grand Lodge session, he said, I don't agree with it, but you voted upon it. We now have an official cipher that you can use. You know, there are restrictions on it. You can't have a cipher even on lodge property.
Wow.
You can study it at home.
You can bring the book at home or whatever the cipher is.
Yeah. You cannot use it to teach candidates.
How do they limit that, or how do they prevent you from doing that? Okay, I'm not. Yeah, I'm rules lawyer.
So you know what? Honestly, though, I will say there are minor variances, right? As with any published, any publication, there are Scrivener errors and there is errata, stuff like that. And so there are minor differences that you can tell they learned this from the cipher.
Wow.
If you know the ritual well enough, right?
Yes. So what you're telling me was all word of mouth before then.
It was officially all word of mouth. But like I said, they've had the unofficial cipher, that you could buy since probably the 20s and 30s.
Interesting.
Yeah. They just made it to where now, okay, you wanted this, we have it.
Yeah.
But that's why here in Texas, I have a hard time comprehending jurisdictions that have plain text ritual. Because for me, that is like the line you can't cross, right? And it doesn't take too much to read a Masonic cipher. It's pretty easy. If you know the ritual, you can pick it up pretty easy.
The ritual book in DC is not a cipher. Oh, well, it's there are letters taken out. I think vowels are taken out, in fact. So you can read it and you can learn it and you can go, okay. But there's stuff the charges are in plain text.
In Texas, it's the same way. The ritual so the monitor of the Grand Lodge of Texas they have the prayers, they have the charges are plain text. And you can publish those all you want because they've already been published by the Grand Lodge of Texas, right?
Got it. Okay.
And there's also, it's interesting, like the treasurer's duties and the secretary's duties are also in there, not in the ritual.
Huh. So. Interesting. Okay. So for anyone who's not a Mason or is not a Mason and is listening to this, number one, who are you? I'd like to know more about you. But number two, it varies by state.
Yes.
So DC is different, Virginia is different, Texas is different, Tennessee, California, they're all different.
But there's so many
we
different,
say these things.
There's so many different variations too. Even this is your first time in Texas.
This is my first time in Texas in a Masonic capacity. I came here work back in the day pre-COVID, back in the day for some medical stuff that I was working on. But this is my first I'm going to go to a Texas Lodge and I'm going or the Grand Lodge building or Anson Jones.
So the staves and rods, we don't touch them. The only time those are actually used, we have them in all of the lodges.
They're in a row, lined up, I noticed. At least for the Royal Arch.
So that's for the Royal Arch banners.
That makes more sense. Okay, because the banners were not hung on there. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
you have they stand by the deacons and the stewards, like most Masonic lodges.
That's actually a DC thing. When we open and close, we do not use the staves.
Oh, very cool. Okay. Yeah, most jurisdictions I visit, they do.
Yes, that's right. And in Maryland and Virginia, literally within less than 10 miles from each other, they both use the rods. You walk 45-degree angle, but in Texas, you do not, you're telling me.
Correct. Yeah, the only time we ever use them is when we receive a district deputy grand master.
Or ritual. Do you do it for ritual?
No, we don't touch it in ritual.
Interesting. Okay, in DC ritual, we do.
Okay.
We use rods.
So I was originally initiated in Oklahoma, and I was passed and raised in Arizona as courtesy work because shortly after I became an EA, I ended up moving to Phoenix to take a job. I was a contractor for Intel.
Okay.
So there I received my fellowcraft and master's degrees at Chandler Lodge, which is now Thunderbird Lodge. So they carry the rods.
Wild.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because when I visit lodges in other jurisdictions, you'll see some lodges that have like a place
stand.
for the
yes,
stand.
That's right.
But some lodges don't have that.
In Maryland, at least the lodges that I went to in Maryland, they don't have a stand. So you have to have it lean on you as you're doing something. I'm not going to say what, but if you were at the altar, for example, you would lean on it. Versus in Virginia, there's a stand. You just put the rod there, and you're able to freely move around.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's sometimes you'll see the deacon will lean it against the altar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've seen that done before.
You know, one of the things that I would when I travel, and we talked about this when we went out for dinner for a bit, is international travel.
Hmm.
And people get very sensitive about, oh, this is how we do it, and you sort of conform to what you do. I like this idea of you do what you do in your Grand Lodge.
Right.
So this may not make sense to any Mason, but in certain Grand Lodges, I'll say, you hold the do-guard or penalty sign.
When you talk to the master or when you speak to the lodge?
During the opening of the session.
Oh, wow.
There are points where you hold the do-guard.
Okay.
And there are points where you don't hold the do-guard. And there are points where certain Master Mason signs are done, and in certain jurisdictions they're not. And so to me, I always say, do the thing that you do in your Grand Lodge, but when you're visiting, show them how you do it, because I think that's nice to do it differently. And then people, the best part about that is they look at you and go, what the hell is this guy doing? And then afterwards you say, well, actually, in my jurisdiction, we hold the penal sign.
Yeah.
While you guys don't, we hold the penal sign. So I feel like do that stuff that's yours, because that's yours. And you should be proud of the stuff that you do. Some guys conform. They look around what everyone else is doing and then they follow it. I don't know. That's just my opinion.
I'll be honest, I conform. I look around, like
you're a conformist.
I'm a conformist.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate it when we have a lot of out of state, sometimes even out of country visitors at Fort Worth 148.
Yeah.
And it's always cool to see the differences. Like when they address the master, they'll
That's right.
hold the do guard.
That's right.
And it's cool to see, it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that's kind of a nice touch,
Yeah.
And it's fine we don't do it, but
Right.
it's cool to see it done as well,
That's right.
because you have to realize it's showing respect.
And that's your custom.
Yeah.
And so it's weird to me when people like don't do their custom, because that's a sign of where you're from, and that helps people show the universality of it. Like, even though it's all different, there are common parts to our ritual, and so it's always nice to see when things change slightly.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that we all conform to one ritual. What I'm saying is, like, if you have a ritual that you do. So, do you guys in the Master Mason degree, do you receive the word? You have to go through and get everyone to see.
I've seen it done when I visit other jurisdictions.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In DC, they don't do it. In Virginia and Maryland, you have to go through every single person and get this one thing. And it terrified me the first day I did it, when I visited a lodge because DC doesn't do it.
Yeah.
So when I went and visited Virginia, there was an old man standing next to me in the meeting and said the thing out loud, so loudly. I was like, oh, thank God. Because I didn't know what to say.
Right.
And so I was so anxious, like, oh my God, this is my first time after being raised. I wanted to go visit because now I'm a Master Mason. I get to travel. And all of a sudden they say, well, yeah, we received the word here. So you got to say this one word, or you're getting in trouble. And I was like, I don't know what this means. And I was stressed out about it until thank God for this old man standing next to me, yelling it out for whoever to care.
Now, did he do that for your benefit?
Absolutely not. I don't think he even knew. I don't think he even knew I was there.
Okay.
It was just, an old timer who...
He was struggling with his hearing aid that night. And...
it just was tweaked slightly off, and he just said the word, and thank God for it, because I was like, I don't know what to say.
So, what's funny is the first time I ever went to a lodge that did that.
Yeah.
I was fairly new to traveling, and I went to New York. I was there for work.
Nice. And
I decided, you know what? I'm going to visit the Grand Lodge of New York. And so I looked to see what lodges for me. And I saw, and I'm probably going to mangle it, La Union Française.
Sure.
Right. And they happened to be doing an entered apprentice degree while I was in town. And so I reached out to the secretary, did the proper arrangements, showed up, thankfully I usually wear a suit to work, and so I was perfectly dressed.
Yep.
Which was very important too, because there was a brother who was also there for work, and he did not have a dark suit. And the worshipful master said, it's acceptable. We talked about it. He's here for travel. It's more important that he's here than that he conforms to the dress code. And so I've made an exception for him, which was very cool. So it's in French. It's a French Rite EA.
Right.
And I knew what they were doing. It's like, okay, the senior deacons are now, they're receiving the word in
Yep.
grip.
Yep.
And because my French is very terrible, I'm able to say my name and catch a couple of words here and there.
Okay.
So I knew what they were doing. As he's coming down the line, I had a hard time hearing. Everyone around me was very quiet
Yep.
when they gave it, covered the grip when they give it.
Yep. Oh, nice.
And when he got to me, I'm like, oh, so it's an EA degree. They must want the EA word in grip. And so I gave it to him, and he kind of shook his head. And then he went again, and I gave it in English. He's like, it's the master's word. And I'm like, okay. And so then you're caught flat-footed. And so I had to think for a second. I'm like, oh yeah, that's it. Okay,
Yep.
here you go. And he's
Yep.
like, okay.
But you got it.
Did.
You survived.
Yeah,
the
but
Inquisition.
I because I did not speak the language, it's like
Sure.
I did not realize that. I did not expect them to do an EA degree opening in a Master Mason's Lodge, which, by the way, I completely support.
Wild.
Yeah.
Oh, did they call down to EA?
I assume so.
Oh, they must have.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, but the French Rite EA is very different than what we normally see in other jurisdictions. It was very cool to watch. So I highly encourage anyone, if they're in the district under the Grand Lodge of New York, that they have like Spanish lodges, Italian lodges, French lodges.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's well worth the visit if you
Nice.
have the opportunity.
Nice. I'm going to be up there for a lot of Lafayette activities. It's the city of Albany. I'm speaking at their official Lafayette proceedings. I'm speaking at the Livingston Library.
Okay.
And I'm going to try, fingers crossed, perhaps the Grand Master will invite me, but I'm going to attend their banquet, which is the night of the actual 200th anniversary. It'll be on the night of when Lafayette was welcomed by the Grand Lodge of New York.
Okay.
And so that should be really cool and interesting.
So you may want to reach out to that lodge.
Yeah.
Because
actually, they reached out to me because they have some Masonic connection to Lafayette as Frenchmen. The members were associated to Lafayette. I believe they were in the military together. I think there was a Revolutionary War, or perhaps prior to that.
when I visited, it must have been 6-7 years ago, I remember the master told me that at one point in the early 1800s, the master of the lodge, he would actually wear Lafayette's sword.
Yeah, and I've asked for validation for that.
Okay.
Because so I know that you and I have talked about this, and if anyone's ever listened to any of my other podcasts on specifically George Washington and Lafayette, I'm really anxious. I'm not here to validate or confirm the authenticity of Lafayette artifacts.
Right.
I would venture to guess that maybe half or less than half are real.
Okay.
But it's a tradition, and it's not my job to go out there and be like, this is wrong, this is not accurate.
Right.
Because in many cases, those relics are contemporary to the time.
Yeah.
But it just so happens that some guy's like, actually, this is Lafayette's apron. It's like, well, where? There's no record of it. Why are you calling this Lafayette's apron?
Yeah.
And so for my book on Lafayette, I was joking to you about this earlier, about how I had to word it and be like, this item is associated with Lafayette. It's not Lafayette's apron. It's just an item that we believe is associated with Lafayette. And I think that covers me from any, mal-education or malfeasance.
Okay.
In my writing.
Well, and that's something we were talking about earlier, was the importance of documentation. But before we get too much into that, I do want to talk about Sam Houston Templar connection.
Yeah.
That you had told me earlier.
Did the podcast cover it, or did part of it, or do we just want to start from scratch?
We should start from scratch, because it was the very beginning when you were talking about. Yeah, it passed that whole thing.
Darn. Okay.
Yeah.
So for listeners, when we recorded the first part, the video or the audio cut off so we missed the part about Sam Houston. So yes, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. So I, as a DC Knights Templar sitting commander of my commandery, and I have a partial association with Sam Houston. Well, I jokingly say that I have a connection to Sam Houston, an ownership of Sam Houston, at least as a Knights Templar, because there's no record, or at least let me take a step back. We find out there was a rumor that Sam Houston was initiated in Washington Commandery Number 1. Washington Commandery Number 1 was organized in 1824, 1825, 1826. And so it's one of the older commanderies. The recorder of Washington Commandery reached out to me a while ago, and he was like, "Hey, Chris, we're doing this thing where, 1824, it was 1825, excuse me. The commandery was formed in 1825. We have very few records of that original commandery. It's just a function of time. Maybe some secretary had it in a closet somewhere, or in his basement, or in his garage.
Like you do.
And it was as where all the best Masonic primary sources are, in someone's garage in 90-degree heat. And so we lost those records. We don't know where they are. And so they were trying to figure out, well, we heard a rumor that Sam Houston was somehow associated to Washington Commandery. And so I talked about this in the other podcast, a guy named Benjamin B. French, who was a Grand Master of the Grand Encampment Knights Templar during the Civil War. He was a 2-term Grand Master, and he actually served before the war and after the war as his term as Grand Master of the Grand Encampment. And so as I was doing research on this guy, whose diary is awesome and interesting, and it's in the Library of Congress, and I'm working on creating a book on it, digitizing his records and pulling out the Masonic stuff associated to, Benjamin B. French's life. I find in one entry, I forgot the date. It was, Albert Pike was in town. I'm paraphrasing. Albert Pike was in town, and he visited, and we conferred the anointed high priest degree upon him. Albert Pike was a past grand high priest of Arkansas. I think he was very prominent. People knew who he was, and he, because of his sort of association with the Scottish Rite, that's how they met French, and he was part of the National Masonic clique. Mm-hmm. And then a month later, in his diary, it says, again paraphrasing, visited, attended, or presided over Washington Commandery Number 1, where we initiated Sam Houston, or I think it was General Houston at the time, into the orders. And then we all, went out for oysters or something, which is my favorite part of that whole thing. Well, he's like, this was great, but also we went out for oysters. Like, the oysters was the more important thing in that sentence,
right.
Which I appreciate, the food being more important in the Masonic context than the man who was initiated.
Fork and knife Templar.
It's real. It's a real thing. Body by Masonry, man. It's a real thing. And so I just love this idea that Sam Houston. And so here I am, a DC Mason, DC Knights Templar, going back to Texas, or going to Texas, excuse me, and then getting involved with the Lodge of Research and Sam Houston. And I have that little connection. So you guys have Sam Houston, the Mason.
Right.
I have Sam Houston, the Knights Templar, which I appreciate.
Hey, we talked about this. Sam Houston's Templar sword is down in Huntsville.
I'd love to see that. And I wonder if there's an inscription around Benjamin B. French, or maybe a connection there with French. I'm very curious.
I have not gone down. I drive through Huntsville on my way down to Houston for Masonic events all the time.
Yeah.
I keep thinking I should stop, and I've yet to stop.
Yeah. That was one of those aha moments. I know we were talking about research, and I hope we can have just more of a discussion on research. But that was one of those like random aha moments of like, whoa. And this was like, several months after I had that conversation with that secretary, or recorder rather, excuse me, who wanted to know a little bit about Sam Houston. It was just, you sort of find this stuff, you're not searching for it, but all of a sudden when you do, you're very grateful and thankful that you did find it, and go, oh, look, here's something else that I didn't think about, or I wasn't looking for it, but here it was.
But what's funny is you're right. You do come across this stuff. Well, you're on a totally different hunt, and you come across this one item, and it sticks with you, and you're like,
yes,
I need to come back to that and write about that. My paper for full membership for Texas Lodge of Research was on Samuel May Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And I went down to Galveston, the Harmony Lodge number 6, where
Okay.
he was a member. And they still have the original minutes going back to the Republic of Texas. They weren't destroyed in the hurricane, which I was surprised because
Was that a thing?
at Galveston, there was a hurricane. There was like 2 hurricanes, but one was really bad. Like the entire island was under like 10 feet of water.
And it destroyed Masonic records, or was it the Masonic Hall or something? Or
Well, so the
or I
minutes
guess
survived.
it didn't. Yeah, that's right.
The minutes survived. I don't know how, but
Wow.
I remember as I'm reading through, and these are from 1837 through
Okay.
1840, and as I'm flipping through, they have the minutes for the meetings, open on whatever night,
Right.
and they had it just written, and you could tell it was the same secretary who had written the original minutes back in the 1830s.
Yeah.
In the corner, at an angle, he had wrote Marable Lamar, and then he wrote occupation, President of the Republic.
Whoa.
And he came in that night, and by special dispensation, and at the time, Samuel May Williams, who was serving, he was either their pro tem junior warden or he was their senior warden at the time. He was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Texas. And so it's no surprise that by Grand Master's dispensation, even though Marable Lamar was from another lodge, he was an EA with a different lodge, they conferred his fellowcraft degree that night. But it's crazy to see, these crib notes like, oh yeah, by the way, we had a candidate. Who was he? The President of the Republic.
That's so great. I'm helping Alexandria Washington digitize their Masonic minutes, and that was one of the things that happened. Like I'm going through the minutes, and I completely missed the part where there's this little star that says George Washington. I'm like, oh shit, I completely didn't even see that. I had to go back because I was looking at a history of the lodge that was printed, I think, in 1890 or something,
right.
And it said that Washington attended this meeting. I'm like, no, he didn't. I just scanned that. I didn't see that. I went back and I was like, oh yeah, this small little indent, under visitors with a little asterisk that said G.O. Washington. It's like, oh man, it was right there. I didn't even think of that. I didn't even see it. Yeah. It was so small. It was so uninteresting and barely there.
Wow. And stuff like that. Yeah. It leaps up. You find it. It's unexpected. And it's these little nuggets, these treasures of history. And that's why I love going through archival records, because you find stuff like that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. That's true. That's very true. That's very cool. I have a question for you.
Okay.
So you're in Lodge of Research, Worshipful Master. Your
Past Master.
Past Master. That's right. Excuse me. You're Past Master. What are the types of questions that you get from non-members about research?
So number one, how do I find a research topic?
A topic.
A topic. That's number one.
Okay.
Right. Number two, where do I find resources to write my paper?
Right. Those are the 2 big ones.
Yes. So topic is always number one. And I'm like, just pick up a proceedings, or go through your lodge's minutes.
Yeah.
And something will jump up at you. There's so much unanswered stuff. And when I posted the concise index that we now have on the website, one of the comments I saw on Facebook when I posted, hey, it's now available, is some guy's like, oh, it looks like everything's been written about it. I'm like, by no means.
BS.
Yeah, there's so much out there. Yeah. Most of the lodges in Texas, we have the numbers go up to 1,600.
Yeah.
And I would say probably 99% of those do not have a lodge history that's been published for Texas Lodge of Research. Lots of Masons that were crucial in the formation of the state or the educational system. A lot of people don't realize that Texas Masonry really built the Texas educational system.
Wow.
Yeah. So
the educational system.
Educational system. Yeah. Fort Worth 148, my home lodge. There was our original charter secretary. Our lodge was the first 2-story building in Fort Worth. And in the top floor, the Masonic Lodge met like it does. It was kind of a normal thing back then, right? In the 1800s. The bottom floor was used for a church service on Sundays.
Oh, wow.
And it was used as a school during the week. And our charter secretary was the person who ran the school.
The rector? No, that's different. Rector is not right. Principal.
Well, he was the teacher, right?
Got it,
Probably the only
okay.
guy who's like, you got kids, bring them over, I'll
Yeah,
teach
yeah,
them
yeah, yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Oh,
And
it's those one room classrooms where it's like,
on the first floor of the Masonic Lodge, yeah. And that, so it was John Peter Smith, right? Because we have a hospital named after him in Fort Worth.
wow.
So John Peter Smith was our charter secretary, and he started this school. The school then became Adnan College. Adnan College became something else, and Texas Christian University is one of the descendants of that original school.
Wow.
Yeah. And Lamar, when he was president of the Republic, he donated the land that Texas A&M is now built on. That was, and Masons built schools. They ran schools. You can see in newspapers where, I think it was in Tyler, there was a girls' school that was run by Masons. And so the Masonic Lodge appointed the board of directors for this girls' school. And so that was a normal thing. Texas built the education system
That's
from
wild.
Masonry.
That's wild.
Yeah. So and Texas, I don't know. I mean, every state, oh yeah, a lot of our forefathers were, the founding fathers of our state were Masons. In a lot of cases, that's true.
Yeah.
But Texas, there's a reason why the 5-pointed stars on the Texas flag. And one of our first secretaries of state gave a speech in Maine right after the formation of the Republic of Texas, where he said that the Texas flag was created to symbolize the 5 points of fellowship.
Wow. Nice.
So
Interesting. I feel like when people say, "Oh, everything has been covered already," it's like, what are you talking about?
look harder.
Look harder, and also just like focus on your town or your old lodge or your jurisdiction, and also realize that, like, the thing that I wish we did more of, or that we had a better relationship with, is state or local historical societies. Because I guarantee you, well, it's twofold. Number one of these really good historical societies probably has stuff that you've never seen. Number two, historical societies are looking for Masonic content. They're interested to know that these mayors or prominent individuals were Masons. And so being able to give them a resource that say, hey, look, here's what John Smith Jr., who served as the first mayor of this town, well, he went out, he was a past master of X Lodge, because when the town was created, they also created the Masonic Hall. They got a charter to, and so all these research societies are not, I'm not saying that they're desperate for it, but it's like, oh, thanks for adding a different component to one's social life. You know about, maybe they have land records or tax records,
right?
But now you've given them resources on stuff that they might not even knew existed.
The Texas State Historical Association has the Southwestern Quarterly. They also run a website that has a ton of information about Texas Masons and their impact on the development of the state.
Wow.
Yeah. So tsha.org, I think, is the website. Tons of information, including some of the Masonic connections.
Nice.
For our state's founders.
But they can do that for California. They can do that for Florida. You can do that for whatever state that you're in. You can have a better relationship with your state or your jurisdiction's, whatever it's called, your historical society.
Yeah.
That's an avenue where you can learn more about it. And there's, I think you asked that second question that people asked you about, like, where do you go for stuff?
Right.
To me, it's if you're not doing proper, I know this is going to sound so snotty, but to me, it's like you're not doing proper Masonic research if you don't have the proceedings of the organization.
Right.
If you don't have periodicals, if there are periodicals, if they're not, then that's fine. But if you can access periodicals, if you don't have a subscription to newspapers.com.
Right. Which a lot of times is bundled with ancestry.com.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so you can get and then you were talking before, and I'm not sure if this was recorded, but Ancestry had records of things that you wouldn't even, there was stuff there. There was supplemental information there, I think, on George Fleming Moore.
That's right. Yeah, we were talking about, I did a presentation I've given a couple of times on Sam P. Cochran and George Fleming Moore in the American Masonic headquarters. And it's something I plan on developing into a full academic paper eventually.
Right.
When I was doing my research for it on Ancestry.com, I found the actual passport applications from when they applied in the middle of World War One to go to England and France to set up the
To
American
set up
Masonic
these.
headquarters.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and not just their passport applications, including photos and all their biographical information that you have to include with it. There were the notes between
Commentary.
yeah, the assistant, secretary of state, the undersecretary of whatever,
It's great.
and it's these notes about this is high priority, or sometimes it was a case of pushback. And that was
Right.
part of the presentation I gave was I could show, hey, this guy who actually, wrote this note, here he is. Here's a picture of him. This was the
Yeah.
guy. This was his office. This is what he did. Here's how he impacted that whole process.
That's nuts.
And all of that is available on Ancestry.com.
We talked about something called Happy Trust, and I know we both use it very much. What is Happy Trust?
So Happy Trust is a network with a lot of digitized books from universities, public and private libraries, a lot of hard to find information, lots of Masonic proceedings that are hard to find, you can't find anywhere else. It's on Happy Trust.
Right. And I think the thing that I like about Happy Trust is it's very easy to search for stuff. Like there's keyword searches, and they do a very good job at searching through stuff. And the other thing is, I mean, I understand if you don't have access to it, I understand maybe you can find a brother who can, but I think one of the other tools in your toolkit of trying to find stuff and doing primary research is if you have a university email address.
Yeah.
You might think, oh, I have a university email address back in the day. They let me keep my email, but I don't really use it anymore because I use Gmail or whatever. But Happy Trust, you need a institutional email address that could let you in. So at a minimum, I know that I've done it. I know, Billy, we've talked about this before. Having a university email is one of the critical. I mean, it's a great thing to have if you can get it.
Right.
If you still have it, if you are fortunate enough to go to college and your college still lets you use your old email address.
Well, here in Texas, they have a network. Like I'm in the master's program at the University of North Texas.
Right.
So I have access to the University of North Texas's libraries. But there is a program that allows me to sign up, and it gives me a card that allows me to go to over 1,000 different universities in Texas, including Baylor, Rice, that have these fantastic esoteric and Masonic collections.
Right.
And I can check them out as if I was a student at that institution.
I think it's fair to say across the United States, there are institutions that have Masonic ritual, Masonic stuff, and people don't necessarily know that it's there.
Yeah. Well, like we were talking about before, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has J. Ray Schute's personal papers.
And those papers didn't go to the Allied Masonic degrees where he was a founder, or Blue Friars where he's a founder, or all these organizations. It went to UNC Chapel Hill.
Yes. Yeah.
I think people forget about that.
So, and that's one of the first things I do is if I'm looking up someone, I look to see what universities he was associated with, and I reach out to see if they happen to have their personal papers, because there's so much good stuff in there that you could find correspondence.
Yeah.
In their Masonic, you can find a lot of information that would go towards a Masonic biography. I know the University of Texas has several prominent Masons from our Texas history in their private collections.
Wild.
Yeah, and it just takes a call, right, and follow the process that they outline, because some libraries have restrictions. You can't bring in any laptop bags.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
If you go to the Library of Congress, for example, you cannot go into the Library of Congress's manuscripts or any of the division with a backpack. You have to lock it up.
Mm-hmm.
They will allow you to have a USB that you can connect your USB key into a computer that will allow you to scan and upload files there.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where I'm like, if you're going to go to the Library of Congress, you're going to the National Archives, make sure you are prepared, because it's not like you show up with your laptop and your phone and expect to take photographs and,
Well, and that's another thing too. Photographs, you need to ask them for their photography policy.
Right.
Because some places you can use your phone, you can bring in a scanner, and then some places are restrict you to, they have to take a photograph for you before you
Right.
can use it in any kind of publication.
Right. Oh yeah, and then it's permissions issues and
Yes.
yeah. I feel like the one issue with the fraternity, not everyone, excuse me, from a historical standpoint, I feel like we didn't have enough professional historians doing stuff. It's always, here's past master John Smith, who's just been a master for 15 years, and now he's in charge of the library, and he's, an old retired chemist or biologist,
Mhm.
but he's doing this on the side because he really likes research, and it's really important to him. And so these guys are not trained on how to properly manage or index or catalog.
Right.
I've been to Masonic libraries and museums where I'm like, oh, John works here part-time and he comes in once a week to do certain work. So you got to make sure you get him on a Wednesday or a Monday because that's when he's there.
Right.
And what does he do? Well, he works at the university and that's his main job. But then he likes to do stuff on the side and help us out here. And it's like, in order for you to know what's there in your jurisdiction or your library, you should take a little bit of time of, like you said, like learn a little bit about the odds and ends of how your library and museum work.
Yeah. And especially because you want to remain on their good side, because if you publish something and you don't follow the proper process, I know it's not always necessary to ask for permission, especially if something is now in public domain because due to time or what have you. But it's always good to just touch base and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I did some research at your institution. I'm going to submit this for publication. Just want to make sure it's okay. Because they may not be able to prevent you from publishing, but they can prevent you from coming back and doing more research.
That's right. You might get blocked, or they'll say no, thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I sort of feel bad. I've had to, unfortunately, because you go through Happy Trust, you go through all these different sources, and you sometimes find, oh, here's an interesting book I don't know, where I can find. Maybe you call New York or Massachusetts or Iowa, the big lodges, the libraries there, and you're like desperately like, oh, you got to be nice to these folks because they're the ones that
they hold the keys to the kingdom.
They hold the keys. When we were driving, and I don't know if we caught this on the first podcast, when we were driving, we talked about the relationship between how Masonic researchers engage with each other.
Okay.
I don't know what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting because it's almost like there's a small club, right? And it seems like when you kind of break into that club, it's somehow you are going to get networked to everybody else in the club. That's my thoughts of it, right? It seems like
that's right,
because we see each other at Masonic Week, our other Masonic events, and you get to know each other.
Yeah.
And it's weird, I remember actually we were at Masonic Week this last time.
That's right.
And it's funny because I remember someone was talking to me at our vendor booth, and you walk up and you're like, "This is Billy Hamilton."
Yeah. Well, I really liked the book that you published, and I was listening to I think it was the Masonic Roundtable where you did a presentation.
Oh, okay.
For them, and it was just like, I think you're right. I think there are very few Masonic researchers, and I think it's slightly becoming a little bit of a niche market.
Yeah.
You know who the guys are publishing. There's not a lot of books coming out, but when they do, it tends to be a very good book.
Yeah.
And I know that you're highlighting some stuff that you're working on right now. I'm like, it's never been published before. And once it becomes published, it becomes something that's new and different and engaging, and you're advancing Masonic research. I find, and maybe I don't know what your thoughts on it.
Okay.
I tend to find that, like, I think Masonic research follows not normal, maybe that's not the right word, but non-Masonic research, like academic research, where it's usually, hey, I've got this little corner of this farm that I'm working on, and maybe other researchers are doing the same thing, but there tends to be a little bit of a silo, or you're doing your thing here, I'm doing my thing here. If we find a way to work together, that's great, but there's no expectation to do it.
Right. Yeah.
There's no joint papers, like Ruli at Hamilton at Wages at the Hoyas. It's always one or two people and maybe one person prints.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's because we You know what it is, as we're doing research, and I'm sure you're probably the same way. When I was doing a research for the Lightfoot book, I found other things. I'm like, oh, well, that would be my second book.
Right.
And then you find something else and you're like, okay, that's going to be my third book.
Yeah.
And you find that you have a backlog.
Yes.
And so because of that, though, you already have this pre-created backlog. And so when you run into other authors, it's like, do our backlogs match up?
It's like dating or something. It's
Right.
like, what are your interests?
Right.
What do you like to do?
So I think maybe that's the reason why you don't see too many collaborations. But you're right. It's a small group because we got to know each other, and then so we know other authors in
Yeah.
common. Adam Kendall,
Yeah.
Bob Davis,
That's
Art
right.
De Hoyos, Brent Morris. It's like there's almost like a club, you know?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say it's an exclusive club because I don't feel like we would keep anybody out. It's just there's not too many people that seem interested in joining it.
Right.
Or they may have interest in it, but don't necessarily follow through and go through the process
Yeah.
of publication. And especially when it's so anybody can publish a book, but when you publish a cited book that has,
Yeah.
Here are my sources, here are the letters between different people that explain how I came to this conclusion.
That's right. That's right.
And that's a whole different level of Masonic research, because anyone could say, oh, here's what I think a Master Mason should do. Here's what I think a worshipful master should do. But it's a whole different skill set.
And I catalog all those books like as self-help. Like that to me is like business, organizational structure, self-help. That to me is like no references. Here's how I feel. I'll pull some stuff out of, I don't know, like Six Sigma or the business world or technology world, and I'll try to find a way of doing it. Now that stuff is great for those who are interested in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also like a trial by fire of like, okay, well, I think I've certainly been in a situation where I've said things like, well, have you read Michael Pohl's book on X? Have you read, Billy's book on Y? Have you read Art's book on Z?
Right.
And you start to be like, oh, this is the guy that's the stuff that they're focusing on. And so you talk to that person, because then that person can also help you get to those different books. Or like, well, actually, when I was writing this book, I thought that this writer or this resource is very helpful.
Yeah. And
I think that as the more refined we get, the more far down the rabbit hole we get, I think we start to go, this guy is doing it right. Like Brent and Art are doing fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to listen more to what they're saying versus guys on the other end who are still haven't got to that point yet. They're missing something. Oh, their references aren't right. Or, oh, he's using Mackey, or he's using Manly P. Hall. Like, he's got to use the right references. Or something that even caught me when Art was like, hey, Chris, you're using a wrong version of this source. You should be looking at the original printed source that was printed in 1801 versus the reprint in 1827. And this is such arcane information. Right? It's such like, well, I didn't know that was even a thing. Well, it's like, well, I'm talking to the guy who spent 30 freaking years figuring out, and I'm sure you know the differences too. Like, I don't know anything about Texas Freemasonry, but I'm sure if I read something and I went to you, and you're going to go, well, actually, Chris, that might not be necessarily accurate, or, So to me, I think there are guys out there. So maybe, I guess, to add to what we were saying, what's another resource is find the guys that have worked on it or are currently work on it, and then maybe have a discussion and engage with them.
Well, and the great thing about that is I have yet to, out of all the people I've ever reached out to, Masonic authors like that, I've yet to have one say, go away. I don't have time for you. Every single one of them has been super gracious with their time.
Very good.
Because it's their passion. They want to talk about it. And if someone else is interested in it, then you could tell that they enjoy the conversation just as much as you do. And so I think you're right. Other authors that have been there or have worked on similar things, they're more than willing to talk about it. I mean, that's why they wrote the book in the first place, is because they wanted to tell people about it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Do you find that it's easy to write a book? It's really the research aspect there, or is it vice versa? Is the research easy and it's difficult to write a book?
So I feel like the research, it comes in a flood.
Okay.
And the hard part then is trying to separate what's important versus something that may even be incorrect, because when you do research, you're going to find different variations in it. How do you get to the true version of it? For me, the research is definitely the most fun part.
Yes.
There's something about walking into an archive, and especially if you know that it is unpublished material, nobody's looked at it, and there's something exciting about that. So the research is the part I like the best, but I think it takes more effort because you have to sift through it. You have to make sure
Right.
that your data is correct, right? Because data is key, right? Data quality and integrity, because
I'm going to say a stats term: garbage in, garbage out.
exactly, yeah. So it's maybe not the easiest, but it's the more fun part of writing. And then the writing itself, it can be tedious because I don't know about you, but I will write something and then I will read through it and read through it and read through it. And then I find that I have to, if I read it aloud, I'll catch things that I could have been over it a dozen different
I'm
times.
so glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I actually read out loud all of my work.
Okay.
I read White House and Freemasons out loud to myself because that's how it's just a way. I think it's like a way that people learn. It's like audio visual
Mm-hmm.
versus reading versus like doing, like manipulating stuff. People learn that way too. And so to me, at least, I like to. Apparently, Tolkien did the same thing.
Okay.
Tolkien wrote as if he was speaking to someone because he was obsessed with myth, or like the idea of myth.
Right.
And he was so angry, or disappointed perhaps is the better word, that England didn't have a national myth like Italy or Greece or Germany had. And so he created Lord of the Rings, or the entire Silmarillion and all this stuff.
Right.
And so he did it as a speech, like it was like Homer talking about the Iliad. And so that was what Tolkien did as well. Now, I'm not trying to compare my stuff to that, but what I was saying is that mentality of like, I'm trying to communicate. To me, I found, and this is what I write when I tell people, I say, write simply.
Right.
Don't write like it's a technical manual that you are using like $20 words. Like, write simply as if you're communicating a story, and those stories tend to be interesting or engaging. There was a guy who literally told me, I liked your book up until the end, the last chapter. The last chapter was very mechanical because you didn't have any story. It was just the president did this, the president did this, the guys went there.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, because there wasn't a story. The story is there wasn't anything going on.
Right.
And so it's so interesting that someone caught that. It was like, in the beginning of the book, it was great because it was a story and it flowed well.
It had a
that
narrative.
last chapter, it was just like, there was no story to the engagement of the Freemasons and the presidents.
Okay.
And he was like, I just couldn't grasp it. And I was like, I think that's a function of the story itself.
Right.
That we didn't have guys who were liaisons to the White House. And so it's sharing a story in simple terms, in simple language. And that's why I speak and I review it and read it out loud. And I'm like, does this make sense? Just like you said, like you catch stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you can get too close to it. It's almost like getting snowblind, right? You'll read over something over and over again to the point to where even if it's wrong, it's like it has become too familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you read it out loud, because it's a different form of input, you process it differently.
Right.
And I think you pick up things. And even then, sometimes things still slip through. So Art is currently taking a look at the manuscript for my next book because he's agreed to write the introduction for it. And he pointed out so I have biographies of the heads of the Order of Ishmael, right? Before I get into the ritual of Ishmael.
Spoiler alert.
I'm used to, you learn in school, write name, and then you could write a pronoun. So like Kenneth Mackenzie was born, he did, and then you go back to the name. And you learn that in school, and it's kind of when you don't think too much about it, but when it's on the printed page, it looks aesthetically unpleasing.
Yes.
And so he pointed it out. He's like, you realize almost the beginning of every paragraph is very similar. And so I took a look at it, and then I read it aloud, and I thought about it. I'm like, you're right, absolutely. And so I rewrote it, and tonally and aesthetically looking, it's so much better now.
Yeah.
And it was just a matter of just changing some of the positioning of stuff before, because it was like just Kenneth McKenzie, Kenneth McKenzie,
Yeah.
Kenneth McKenzie.
Right.
And you get too close to it. You spend so much time on it, it doesn't jump out at you until someone points it out.
Yeah. I think having peer review is helpful. I think, and in fact, I think it's necessary. You
Yeah.
need someone else to look at it and go, hey, man, you might want to check XYZ because it might be off.
Right.
Or it might be. The problem is, do you have someone who can do that?
Yeah.
You know, it's nice that Art can do it, and he can like review it and give you some pointers on that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't have that.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the Masonic fraternity, I think it helps find someone of like mind in your lodge,
Yeah.
you know, or even in your district, and ask their opinion. Hey, what do you think about this? Even if it's give them small bits, or take a piece of it, do a presentation, that could help too. Ask people, what did you think about it? But I think you're right. Feedback is very important.
Yeah.
And it's something we overlook a lot, you know.
Why is that?
I think it's because we're so focused on getting it out there. We really, and sometimes I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I don't think we cover up our writing to say, I don't want anyone to look at it until it's done, until it's ready.
Until it's perfect.
Yeah. And it's never going to be perfect. Even when you go through it, I mean, the Joe P. Lightfoot book, I went through it. Joe Ages went through it. My publisher went through it. And even now, I pick up the book and I see a couple of errors here and there, and I'm like, damn it.
Drives you nuts.
Right.
Absolutely. I certainly understand that. Yeah, no, there are people that go, this is perfect.
Yeah.
And I look and go, this is terrible. I can't even believe I wrote this.
Right.
You know, the language is off, or I don't like how I read this sentence. I think
I hate myself.
there's a level in hell for writers who just are basically just sitting there rewriting all of their work.
Yeah.
You know, because they're like, I don't like this. I'm going to redo this again.
And it'll never be perfect. Never.
No, it'll never be perfect.
Yeah. So if you're waiting for perfection, give it up. Make it to where it's good.
Yeah.
It's good enough.
That's right.
Be like the artist who abandons the painting and just say, let it be.
Well, also, there's a thing to be said about second editions or third editions where you can go, well, that was the intention there. You did it, you published it, and then in a second edition, you get to come back with fresh eyes and go, I'm going to, first of all, fix all these weird grammar things that I missed and I'm so angry about, but also just add stuff or do stuff. It was so funny. When I finished the White House book, I had a realization, like an edit, like a eureka moment on George Washington that I didn't include in the book. And I was just like, this is so perfect. It perfectly encapsulates how I want to explain George Washington for my book. And I discovered that after printing the book.
Right. It's already published. It's already out there.
I mean, like, this is perfect. This is exactly how I want to say it. This is exactly how I do it. I wrote it down. And so for the second edition, I'll include it. But I was just like, it did not, in my brain, it did not register at the time that I was writing it.
Right.
I have this idea that Masonic research is split into three parts.
Okay.
It's split into what do you want to write about?
Okay.
The actual physical process of researching, discovery, going through books, going through documents, going through PDFs, and then the writing part.
Okay.
And all three of those parts are just as equally dangerous or difficult or cumbersome or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's three.
Okay. And each of those requires a different skill set,
which writers may not necessarily have,
Yeah.
or at least Masonic writers may not necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good breakdown, actually, because, it's the discovery and then like almost a rediscovery. I discovered it, and now let me discover everything about it.
Yeah.
And then let me put it together so people can, how do I explain what I discovered?
Right. So I think Adam Kendall writes so well. I think he's an expert on that third part. He writes so beautifully, and it's just the prose is very well. I don't. I sound I'm not doing this intentionally. I'm not saying but I'm just like, I write the stuff that I write is so concise that even he called me out on. He's like, you write like you're not a writer. You write like you're a statistician. You write like you're a mathematician. You're very concise, and you're like, John Smith did X, Y, Z.
Right.
Next page or next paragraph.
Full stop.
Blah blah blah. You know. Meanwhile, Adam is like, how does this help advance John Smith's? He just does it in such a way that you enjoy. It's rich cake, I call it, where it's just like it's fluffy, it's nice, people like it. Mine is just like, here's just the icing. John Smith did this, you did this, blah blah blah, and that's it.
Right.
Done. End of sentence. I don't need 40 pages to do this. Here's 2 pages that explain what you do. On to the next story.
Yeah.
And I love the second part of that 3-part. I love the discovery phase.
Mm-hmm.
I love going through old books and going, aha, I found this interesting letter in this old thing of the miscellanea in AMD, from 1946. And I can't believe I found it. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
And some people are like, I'm interested about this story. Like, what am I going to write about?
Right.
What's out there that hasn't been covered yet? Let me think about it.
Yeah. There's.
What side do you think you're in?
So for me,
Of the 3, which one do you prefer?
out of the 3, it is the research. It's that middle part. Again, it's going into the archives and finding something you didn't expect to find. Even better.
Yeah.
Like when I was at the United Grand Lodge of England, and as I was going through the correspondence between Mackenzie and Irwin and Yarker and Westcott, I found a letter, and I know it's been found before because there were some notes on there, and so other people have discovered it, but for me to actually hold it, where it was a letter from Mary Mackenzie, the widow of Kenneth Mackenzie, and she was writing, "Dear Dr. Westcott, I am having trouble going through my husband's papers, and I wonder if you would send the delightful Samuel McGregor Mathers over to take a look at these because I don't speak French." Yeah, and looking at it, it's almost like an aha moment. Like, you don't know, but you feel like this is how the Golden Dawn cipher manuscripts were, how they transferred to Westcott and Mathers, right? This letter is almost like it's a smoking gun, but it's after it's already been fired. So you don't know what the bullet actually was, but was it that magic thing that everyone's looking for?
Yeah.
Because, there's so many different anecdotal stories about how that happened. How were the cipher manuscripts for the Golden Dawn found? And it's like this letter, it's such a tantalizing clue. And you don't expect to find stuff like that, but it's like, there it is. And then there's also the thrill of this letter was actually held by Westcott 140 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Whenever you pull an old letter from 150 years ago. The previous DC Grand Secretary did something that I didn't even think about. He's like, I said, "Oh, we're gonna throw this stuff out. It's not really useful." And he goes, "What happens in 250 years? Someone will really find." And he was like, "Chris, if you found something from the 1790s and it was a receipt, from 1790 about a Masonic thing, you would want to keep that." And I was like, "Okay, that's a good point." Like, keep that stuff, even though it was like trash, and because it's from 2007. Let's toss it. Who wants it?
Yeah, here's the receipt from George Washington for a Stromboli from Vinny's Italian restaurant.
There you go. Yes. Someone wrote a whole PhD just on that Stromboli. Right. Yeah. I don't know. I guess. Do you think that Masonic research is accessible to everyone, every Mason?
I want to say it can be, but in reality, it's not going to be because it does take patience, and sometimes you're going to beat yourself up as you go through it. And so it takes patience and perseverance. But it also takes, you do have to be, if you're going to be an actual Masonic researcher, not a Masonic author, but an actual Masonic researcher, you need to be dedicated to limiting yourself to cited resources, because there's a ton of anecdotal information that it's like, I would love to throw this in the book. I would love to have it in there. It adds such an awesome dimension to it, but there's no proof that that's actually what happened. So I'm going to have to set that aside. And so that's part of, I think, you have to be a purist when it comes down to that. Because we talked about that earlier in the car. We talked about how many cool stories are there, but it's like, great, this is a very important sentence. Cite your source. And that's where it falls down. It's like, okay, I can't do that. And it's like, then it's not really, you can state that there's an anecdotal story about X, but you still have to cite that, right? I found this anecdote here.
That's right. Not only have you have to cite it, but it's good proper form to say this is allegedly. It's probably not the case, but we want to include it for completeness.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's okay as long as you acknowledge. I think one of the good elements of good Masonic research is also acknowledging your limitations and being like, look, I went to this university or this library.
Right.
Here's what we have on that, and here's what I'm going to present to you. And I think what you do then is you, by virtue of you writing that book, you set the foundation.
Okay.
So you are saying you are doing something on Ishmael.
Mm-hmm.
You are presenting to a large audience something that they've very rarely seen. So in other words, you are setting up the foundation for this type of research.
Right.
And that way, I don't think Masons think of it that way. And they go, this is Billy's thing. He's going to be known for it. And no one else can do this research except for Billy. It's like, no, what Billy has done is he's introduced this topic into mainstream Masonic research. And then people can
build
work
a
off that, build a structure on it.
Yeah, like Masons do.
Yes. I think Masons take this ownership. I've done it myself where I'm just like, well, I'm going to be the Masonic president guy.
Okay.
And if that is what I want to do, then great. And I'm going to search out and I'm going to find all this stuff. And so whenever anyone else publishes a thing on Masonic presidents of the United States, in the back of my mind, I go, well, it's not going to be great. Because I'm the one that spent 7 years working on this.
Right.
But the front end side of me, the logical side of me is like, great, maybe they found something new to the advance and maybe they'll contribute to it.
Right.
I don't think we do a lot of that. Have you seen a lot of papers that criticize or add to someone else's work? I don't think I've seen a lot of it.
Right. Or usually it's someone who's coming back and doing a second pass on their own research.
On their own research. That's right.
Yeah.
But there's no like commentaries on Billy's work on Ishmael.
Right. Yeah. The only commentaries I've seen is commentaries on like morals and dogma.
Yeah.
But because it's so dense,
that's
it's like Clausen came back and said, okay, let me really explain it to you.
Right. Or I think Alain Bernheim, Alain Bernheim, who was a Herodom. He used to write a lot for Herodom. He passed away, I think, a while ago. But he did a lot of research on Masonic ritual for Scottish Rite.
Right.
And so he, once or twice, I noticed articles in the Herodom, which was like, he wasn't even doing primary research. He was just responding to research that was printed in Herodom. I think that kind of stuff we don't do.
Right. A critical analysis, you know.
That's right.
That in the way it makes it better, right? Because it points out things that, oh, maybe this is a deficient supposition, right? Maybe I did jump to conclusions here about whatever. And I think if done properly, it makes us all better.
If done properly means you also you add to it. You add some, not just attacking someone's work, but you add to it and supplement and support it, I think. And I don't think we just do that. And maybe that's a Masonic thing. Maybe that's just a cultural thing. Like I know I wouldn't feel disappointed if someone did that. But I would be like, oh, that's interesting that they found something new and great.
Right.
And in my mind, the researcher is like, man, I wish I saw that before. I wish I could include that in my book.
Yeah.
But that's unrealistic.
Well, so to turn the question back on you, what do you think? Is every Mason have the ability to be a Masonic researcher?
I think there is a class of Mason that is interested in research.
Okay.
I don't think every Mason who is a Mason in the United States right now, let's say, gives a crap about it.
Okay.
I think there's a subset of Mason that goes, listen, I just got out of work. I'm going to go to my Masonic meeting from 6:30 to 9:30. I'm going to have my green beans and my cold chicken, whatever, or Popeyes or Chick-fil-A, whatever.
Right.
We're going to go into that lodge hall. We're going to talk about minutes.
Yeah.
We're going to pay our bills. We're going to banter about how much dues are due. And then maybe, if we're lucky that night, we're going to initiate a guy into the inter-apprentice degree or a fellowcraft or whatever.
Right.
And then sayonara, maybe have a drink or a smoke before you head out, and you head home.
Yeah.
And then there's the subset of guys that are like, this is interesting. I'd like to serve as an officer.
Right.
I'd like to serve as a Grand Lodge officer. I'd like to I'd like to really absorb some of this ritual and maybe serve as a lecturer or whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. And I think there's this weird subset of like, well, how did we get to this point?
Right.
How did the ritual? Who's Thomas Smith Webb and who's Duncan's monitor and
Right.
I think those are the guys that are in our category of like we find value in examining and looking at stuff and making the case and having arguments for or doing the research and going, oh, did you see that this interesting connection between this book and this author and this here, or here's a new interesting ritual that has nothing to do with Freemasonry, but it's connected to Freemasonry because Masons were involved, and
Right.
what you're doing, for example, or what Adam's doing with his work.
Right. Or even, there's so much that Masonic ritual has influenced in other organizations. Like I hear about the Future Farmers of America is heavily influenced by Masonic ritual.
Really?
Yeah. In that their meetings are even run like a Masonic meeting. I mean, I don't know because I wasn't in FFA, but I hear about that, or that fraternities, a lot of
Yes.
college fraternities
Yeah.
take a lot of influence from Masonry, and especially because a lot of the people who founded those fraternities
That's right.
were Masons.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would think there's a subset.
Okay.
Now, then the question goes to, do we write for every man or do we write for the Masonic research?
So for me, the answer to that question is honestly, I write for myself, as in I'm interested in this question and I can't help it. I have to dig into it. And so I write down my notes. My notes evolve into a book, right? And so it's like, this is what I was really interested at this period of time. And I wrote it. And by the way, here it is.
Right. Enjoy.
Yeah. And I mean, because I'm sure there are people who write with that in mind. I mean, who do you write for when you write your books?
Well, in White House and Freemasons, I originally wrote it for my wife
Okay.
because I wanted a non-Mason to see what the connections were between Masons and the White House.
Okay.
But now as I'm thinking about it, as I asked that question to you, I wonder, is there value in writing to you or Art or Brent, and then not assuming, but hoping perhaps, well, maybe that's the level that we should be at. We should be Masonic researchers and we should be doing Masonic research. And therefore, if someone's who's not a Masonic researcher or is curious about it, is interested,
Right.
they can read at our level.
Okay.
It's sort of like, why do I want to write or create a technical manual for a guy who's trying to operate a nuclear or is interested in nuclear fission?
Right.
What I'm writing a technical manual is for the guy who actually is doing this, who's managing nuclear submarines or something. Why am I trying to write for someone who's not proficient in that subject?
Okay.
So in other words, if we're talking about your thing on Ishmael or on whatever,
Right.
why am I talking to the guy who's, look, man, I'm here for green beans. We're going to do the 8 degree and whatever.
Right.
Or maybe he doesn't care.
Well, maybe he doesn't know there's more. I mean, there's so my initial lodge, right? I remember being a brand new Mason at 21, the age you had to be back then. I would go in and it's like, I'm excited to talk about Masonry.
Yeah.
And I would go in and we'd have a potluck dinner.
Yep.
And then we would go up to, we wouldn't talk about Masonry at the dinner. It's like, oh, how's your wife doing? She hurt her knee. Did she get over that or whatever? And it was a friendly banner. And there's a place for that. There really is a place for that. But we wouldn't talk about, okay, so I'm a Mason, and I'm a brand new 21-year-old Mason. What is Masonry? We didn't talk about that. And then we'd go up, and being an EA, though, I couldn't sit in the meetings at the time. But I remember going to Arizona, and great lodge, great group of brothers. I have nothing to say against them.
Right.
But again, it's like we didn't really talk much about Masonry in lodge.
Interesting.
And I think there's a lot of lodges where that's the way it is. We come together, we eat dinner together, we enjoy talking to each other as men talk to each other. And then we go in the lodge, we do our business, and then we go home. And there's no, okay, so in the opening, when we do this, why do we do that? Well, we've always done it that way, is usually the answer when you do ask it. And there's no investigation, there's no exploration, there's no questioning. And I think as I read through especially the older Masons' writing, it seems very much like Masonry was intended to be a series of questions. And it was intended, I think, for men who engaged in Masonry to be philosophers and to contemplate, what does this symbol mean? How do I apply it? What does it mean to me? How do I impart it in my daily activities? I think Masonry was intended to make us into philosophers. And somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. And so there's a lot of lodges that I think guys just don't know what to question because they never really talk about Masonry, even at the Masonic Lodge. And sometimes maybe the intro into that questioning is they're like, oh, there's this book by Chris Ruli. Hey, I love George Washington. I love the Masonic presidents. And so they pick it up and they read it and it opens it up to a whole new world.
Yeah.
But it's something that even being a Mason, you may not be exposed to it.
Is our job as researchers to make it available to them or not really?
Available? Yeah, I mean, it should be available. Information should be available, period. It doesn't even have to be Masonry. Is it our job to kind of force people into it? No, absolutely not. But, we can publish our books and hope that someone picks it up and finds it entertaining or enlightening.
Right.
That it has some kind of impact on them.
Right.
But, it's not our job to grab them and say, look at it, If it was, I mean,
we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here.
Interesting. Cool. I think the roadcast will last some final thoughts and discussion points.
Yeah. So I think you bring up an interesting point, though, about should every Mason be a researcher? Yeah. I mean, should every Mason be a ritualist? If that's your interest, it's open to you. Just participate. But anyway, so once again, it's been a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to talk, and we've been talking all day long.
Just get ready for part 2 or part 3, whatever we're at.
All right. So this is Billy Hamilton signing off.
This is Chris Ruli signing off.
All right. Thank you very much.